So I'm Anna Brusutti, and this is Stephanie Malia Hom, and she's a professor. And I'm not going to do the whole introduction because you have it in your brochure and you can look it up, and we want to spend more time talking about the film, right? So, but you may want to tell them about your areas of interest because they are germane to this.
Yes, so hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Malia Hom, as Anna said. I'm a professor of transnational Italian studies here at UCSB in the Department of French and Italian. And my areas of research include tourism, migration, and mobility, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
And this is a film about tourism, migration, and mobility, right? And so that's exactly what we're doing here. So let me start by introducing Camilleri, who wrote these books, right? Camilleri, Andrea Camilleri, who died 2 years ago, was this very prolific writer who wrote about 100 books. And I'm sure many of you have read some of them. They've been translated in every language. Camilleri was somebody who started late to write books. He was kind of a college dropout first, then he started to get into the theater, eventually started to direct, and went on, right, to actually teach theater. And apparently one of the students he had at some point was Luca Zingaretti, the guy who plays Montalbano, right? So Camilleri is somebody who writes these books and starts with the Montalbano character. And at some point, right, true to the Sicilian heritage, I mean, he, in a Pirandellian way, said at some point that the character started to haunt him. He had to write more. But who really haunted him, apparently, was his editor, who realized that these were going to sell well and prompted him to write more and more and more. So Camilleri wrote about 100 books, more or less, short, long, small, kind of collecting short stories, etc. But the Montalbano books are about 30. And from 30 books, there are 37 episodes over the course of 20 years here. 15 seasons, 20 years, 37 episodes, and each one is an hour and a half. How does this kind of system, right? I mean, you think about it. I mean, these were deliriously successful, the books and the episodes. So why not more, right? I mean, than 37? Because Italian television, which was born in 1954, Italian television was actually born the way in which, was born from the parameters that had been set up for radio. And it was imitating the kind of model that the BBC had. American television was born as a commercial enterprise. Italian television was supposed to have the three principles. It was supposed to inform, to entertain, and to educate. Basically, 2 out of 3 were supposed to be boring, right? So informing and educating, and Italian television had, if you look at the archives, wonderful programs, lots of theaters, all kinds of beautiful interpretations, great acting, etc., etc. And then what happened? That right? I mean, the RAI was a monopoly, basically. They had 2 channels, then they introduced the third. By the 70s, other kind of independent televisions were starting to creep up, and they were broadcasting from abroad, right outside the borders or something, right? Capodistria. I mean, those are the ones that we used to watch. So basically, this was opened up. I mean, it kind of undermined the monopoly. And at the same time, it opened up all kinds of possibilities. So what was the problem? That RAI detained the right to broadcast across the entire country. The other ones could only do it locally. And how did they get around it? By basically, when Berlusconi, right, had the great idea, famous Berlusconi, of just simply broadcasting bits and pieces, but the same programs. And that was it, right? And that was the change that was able to completely change the monopoly of Italian RAI. Umberto Eco called these two stages, the before the 70s and after the 70s, or rather before the 80s and after the 80s, the paleo television and the neo television. And those were the two stages, right? And so what the neo television was in competition with all kinds of cheap programming that was supposed to be kind of the equivalent of reality programming, right? I mean, and that was the idea. And so by the time we get to the neo television, it becomes, a free-for-all. And Rai tries to compete and tries to, keep up with the kind of, debasing the programming, so to speak, and keeping up. And the Berlusconi era, turns everything into a kind of a show of reality, women in scantily dressed and so on and so forth, and you probably, have seen some Italian television. So now, after, Montalbano marked a moment when Italian television was trying to recuperate a little bit of the higher ground that they had, programming stuff and directing, and having people propose, right, projects like this. And this was very, very successful. Why? Well, one, Sicily, right? Italians didn't know Sicily very well. I mean, that was part of the problem. Sicily is a beautiful place, and you can see how, the ocean is always there. Salvo Montalbano goes swimming all the time. There is almost every episode has him swimming, him walking on the beach, and etc. and etc. There are all these beautiful places. And that was one thing. And then the other reason why this is so successful is because Montalbano is a flawed character, right? Is very flawed. And you can see, right, how he's trying to make, kind of to uphold his ethic. And then the other one was recuperating the educational and the informative parts. I mean, you can see how in this film, the film opens, right, with the denunciation of the Genoa riots, basically, right? At the moment when the police starts shooting and they actually, kill the protester. And so it opens with that statement, and Montalbano wants to resign and so on and so forth. So there are many, many reasons why, right, this is successful, but also because basically, who is the audience for this film? This is a very conventional kind of procedural type of, film. The audience is somebody who is older than the people who are not watching television, basically. And so the audience actually grew older with Montalbano, right? Over the course of 20 years. First, they started to read the books, and then over the course of 20 years, we all grew older with the commissar, with the Commissario Montalbano. And so it becomes this kind of lovable, right, appointment. I mean, the entire family could agree on watching Montalbano, and that's, of course. And I hope you're going to talk a little bit about the other side of the programming, right, that is quite popular now with... So, for instance, one of the big things is in Montalbano is that even when the mafia is mentioned, Camilleri wanted to make sure that he was never the protagonist of, right, the film, not because it's not an uncomfortable presence, but because it did not want to, have that as the only subject for the film. And Camilleri co-wrote, I think, almost all of these things. And they were also an exception in television programming because they were directed by the same person. Cironi directed all of them until he died. And the last three were co-directed by Zingaretti, by Luca Zingaretti, the actor, who went on to direct, himself in these films. So, but there are many, many things that we can say about, and this is why you're going to be so incredibly, incredibly interesting in this, because I like to hear more of what you think about the situation with the crime in the film, how the film portrays.
Well, that is a great question. Thank you for giving us the context of Italian television. And I also wanted to thank the team here at Carsey Wolf for having us here today and all of you in the audience. The idea of crime is really interesting in this show, and it's something that I've thought a lot about. In fact, in the fall, I taught a course called Crime Italian Style, in which we spent a lot of time on the mafia, as well as other aspects of Italian crime. And we can come back to the mafia, but what I wanted to kind of set the scene with, rewatching this episode again, one of the conversations that stood out to me was the conversation between Montalbano and his friend Nicola Zito at lunch, in which Zito turns to Montalbano and says, "Why do you care about these poor people anyway, questi poveracci?" And Montalbano says, "Well, you know, we're Sicilians. My dad was in Stuttgart, and there was a sign on the window that said, 'Dogs and Sicilians not allowed.' So we were once unwelcome. We were once the poveracci." And so now it's, you know, and implicit in that statement is the reason why Montalbano cares. But also in that statement, it shows how Sicily is a place as a crossroads in the Mediterranean, has been long linked to places elsewhere, right? If we think about Italian Americans and the great numbers of Sicilians who came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and how those immigrants also experienced a lot of discrimination and violence. One of the episodes that we talked about, one of the events that we talked about in my crime class was the mass lynching of Italian Americans in 1891, Sicilians, in New Orleans. And so there's a long history and a long, almost heritage of discrimination and violence, of being the immigrants. And so when Montalbano says this, he's connected to these current flows of migrants coming to Sicily, primarily from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa. There is a well-established central Mediterranean route that goes through from the Horn of Africa, through Libya, and then landing in Lampedusa. So the references that were being made to bodies in the Sicilian Channel are often from these crossings that are made. And in 2005, when this episode was filmed, the crossings predominantly were seasonal. They weren't, in terms of numbers, it wasn't at a peak at all. The numbers have grown exponentially. You know, by the time in 2011 we have Arab Spring that happens, and there are hundreds of thousands of people crossing. And by 2017 with Syria, you know, the numbers again keep increasing. And I know that the organizations that perform rescues in the Mediterranean have told me that it's no longer seasonal. You know, it used to be in the summer, like the crossings were attempted, but now it is year-round. Right. And so my point here is that Sicily becomes this protagonist, and Sicilians and their history, this emigration history, connects to the immigration present. And so, and we can talk about migration and the criminalization of migration, which is something that has been escalating in Italy in the last 5 years.
And I think that's also one of the details, what you mentioned, goes to the educational purpose of this kind of things, right? Look, we were the ones that were, you know, like dogs. Yes. So now, right, and that's part of what Rai, you know, is supposed to be doing and goes back to doing, right? And it's great. Camilleri also is somebody who gifts, right, the language, the Sicilian thickness of the language. Sometimes I'm from the north, so, you know, if you basically diagonally the opposite side. And I had to read the subtitles sometimes because it's very difficult to get, you know, all the nuances of the Sicilian. And Camilleri, the writer, does not take any prisoners on this. I mean, it's like if you don't understand it, just get it from the context. I'm not going to translate it for you. This is us, right? And this is the gift of the language and the vividness of the language. And so now many of these words have entered, right? The thing. And I mentioned before when we were coming in, the fact that now this Sicily has become, right? I mean, this particular program has really contributed to the tourism so much, right? Because it has put basically many of these places on the map, to the point that Porto Empedocle kind of added Vigata to the name or something. Vigata is a fictional place. It doesn't exist, but people are looking for it. and that's the point, right? And so you see all these beautiful Baroque towns, that it kind of, the film spreads it around. The place where Montalbano lives is in Scicli, right? Which is, as you were saying, you were cruised around that area, right? The southeast of Sicily. But basically, it's something that has been turned into a tourist attraction, and so nobody can get into the city hall because tourists are coming in to watch the places where Montalbano was being filmed, to the point that the mayor's room has been turned into a tourist attraction, and they had to move the mayor because everybody wants to go see, right, and stuff like that. So how about the tourist aspect?
That's a very interesting question, because film tourism has a long tradition, a long history. And we think of something like Lord of the Rings and the tourism industry in New Zealand that has sprung up around that film. In Italy, I would say that sort of film tourism in the American imaginary of Italy centered in the 90s around Under the Tuscan Sun. And the film with Diane Lane, and the town of Cortona in Tuscany becomes this destination, right? And then later in the mid-2000s, there's Eat, Pray, Love. So you can go to Rome and see the apartment where Julia Roberts learned to make spaghetti. And, with Camilleri and Montalbano, this is Italian tourists going to Sicily, learning about their own country and kind of exploring a very particular Sicilian tourist imaginary. And I would say that a parallel phenomenon is also happening in Naples with Elena Ferrante tourism, and the HBO series, if people have seen My Brilliant Friend. So now you can go on Ferrante tours in the same way you can go on Montalbano tours in Sicily. So it's growing, but I think for the Montalbano tourism, it is for an Italian tourist audience. I don't think it is for the Americans who are.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I mean, many Italians who have never been to Sicily, they just go to see Montalbano. Yeah. I was looking at the, you can rent. You can stay in Montalbano's house, right? I mean, you can. It's expensive, but yes, I mean, you can be there. And so there is an entire way of selling, right, Sicily, and people are going along with it because obviously.
Well, and in the episode that we watched, I mean, the finale at that tuna factory, I think that was actually filmed in the far northwest of the island, whereas a lot of the other in-town scenes were filmed in the far southeast. So it's two completely different parts of the island. Right. And I think part of what the series does is show you, it reveals to you this island and the diversity of Sicily, because it's very different in Palermo compared to Catania, compared to Ragusa, even the dialect. And so we were talking earlier about the language and how, I don't know if you could hear it in here, but the farmer that he's interviewing is speaking completely in dialect, right? That what he's saying would be almost incomprehensible without the subtitles. Whereas Montalbano is speaking with a regional accent.
Right.
And you can
and
hear
I was making a few notes on some of the words, right? I mean, I was saying, it's like Montalbano sono, right? Yeah. Which is not io sono Montalbano, it's just transposing, the words. Una mazzatina, which is anything that is murder. it's a little killing, right? Una mazzatina.
Mazzatina.
And then the camurria, which is a big bother, or the cabazizi, of course, right, which is whatever, right? don't bother me.
And you hear this connects back to the great Italian neo-realist tradition. If you think of Visconti and his film La Terra Trema, The Earth Trembles in 1948, I think, everything is in dialect, and you hear this kind of richness of the language, and I think Camilleri and Montalbano are recuperating some of this to give this depth to Italian language. And one thing I speak about with my students is that Italian, as we know it today, is standard Italian, or standard Italiano standard. At the moment of Italian unification in 1861, according to linguist Tullio De Mauro, only 2.5% of the entire country spoke standard Italian. Everyone else spoke dialect. And dialects varied from village to village, town to town, region to region, and every dialect was distinct. And it was only with really the advent of radio, and especially the advent of television, that Italian became standardized. And I think with Montalbano, we're seeing this recuperation of the richness of language.
It's a regifting, right? What has been taken away. Because the standardization of the language meant that everybody spoke this kind of, kind of like the Bostonian accent in American films of the 30s or something, right? I mean, it's the same kind of standardized Italian, which is so terrifying. Monicelli, of course, didn't do that. In his films, he actually had regional, accents. He had entire groups of people speaking different languages. But can you speak a little bit more to this idea of the kind of what the rest of Italy thinks about the South as this place, right?
Well, we really get that in that opening scene with the couple from the North. And the reason you can identify from the North first is by their name. Signori Bauzan, any name that really last name that ends with an N, you're pretty sure it comes from the Veneto, from up north.
It's like Cardin.
Yes.
Carden was actually Venetian, right, originally. So it's Cardin, anything like that.
So that by their name and the accent and the stereotypes that they held about Sicily. Well, of course I have to carry a gun because everything is criminal and lawless, right? And so the episode's poking fun at that. Because there is this long-held stereotype of the Italian South as being criminal, uncivilized, backwards, pagan, dirty, impoverished, and it's been given a name as the Southern Question, or the Questione Meridionale. And that's a twofold meaning. Like, one, what is the South, right? How do we represent the South? And at the time of unification in 1861, how do we integrate this South into the idea of a unified Italian country? So here we have, in this episode, just the play on that and kind of poking fun at that. And then when it actually turns out that the northern couple are breaking the law because they don't have a permit to carry arms. And so it actually speaks to this idea of crime in Italy, too, as something that has stereotypically been associated with the South and the mafia, when in fact is and continues to be much more widespread throughout the country.
In class, I actually showed a clip from the Manetti brothers film. It's a musical about the mafia, right? And they actually showed this little segment making fun of Scampia stereotypes. There is an entire group of American tourists who come in. One is robbed and says, "This is great, right? This is the real experience. We were robbed in Scampia, the place where the Camorra is ruling, right?" And so this is not just getting ripped anywhere, right? And they make fun of it because that's obviously one of the stereotypes. Absolutely.
And what's interesting, too, is that the only inkling one gets of mafia in this episode is the word pizzo, which comes up in the conversation about the store, the secondhand store, that she didn't want to pay the pizzo. And the pizzo is a bribe. It's protection money that one pays to the local mafia. So she didn't want to pay the pizzo, so the store was burned down and they had to rebuild it, etc. But that's it. That's the only passing reference that you get in this episode.
Right. Sometimes in other episodes, Montalbano pits two mafia clans one against the other. He's always kind of, negotiating. He's always trying to figure out, the best way to go about it.
But I think the point you bring up about Scampia, which was
in Naples, right?
In Naples, Scampia was a housing complex that was built, I think, in the 60s that has become the center of Camorra operations. And in fact, another great television series is Gomorra, about the Camorra, based on the Roberto Saviano novel, about the Camorra mafia in Naples. And I think comparing that with Montalbano, and especially in Sicily, we know the mafia is the Cosa Nostra.
Right.
Although arguably, some scholars would say that it no longer exists, that in fact it is transformed. There's a recent book that came out by a journalist named Giacomo Di Girolamo called Cosa Grigia. He's been covering organized crime for 25 years in Marsala. And I interviewed him last fall and had him to our crime Italian style class. And what he revealed to the students and to me was that first of all, the last godfather is still on the run, right? Matteo Messina Denaro, of the kind of old school godfather, Don Corleone. Instead, it's become a much more horizontalized operation a la the Camorra in Naples, where there's not necessarily one head godfather, but instead, a series of loosely organized clans. And so it's no longer this Cosa Nostra, this our thing. It's become a Cosa Grigia, a gray thing, insofar as operations no longer center on criminal activities, right, like drug trafficking, human trafficking, as we saw here, but rather there's a porousness between the licit and the illicit. So a lot of mafia activities center on procuring legal public contracts to build public works. So this journalist, Giacomo Di Girolamo, shared with us that 70% of public contracts are from the European Union, so these are EU funds. 70% of those funds coming to Sicily are siphoned off by organized crime.
Fantastic.
So, and think about this, here's another statistic. Recently, Italy was awarded 191 billion euros for COVID recovery. 13.9 billion of that is going to Sicily alone. So you can imagine, follow the money, and you will understand where these webs of crime, both licit and illicit, which I think we see in Montalbano, because there's a porousness between that, how that has evolved into this gray thing.
Ever since I've been alive, there's always been the talk about the bridge over the Strait of Messina, right? And every time that is proposed, it's like, oops, right? It's going to be the costliest, most terribly, riddled enterprise. So that's something I didn't know about this 70%. That's a huge number. Terrifying. So can we talk a little bit more about the character again, right? I mean, the Montalbano. Montalbano has basically there are three male characters and three female characters in the film, right? Which is perfect. And Montalbano has the perfect woman divided by three, basically, right? He has the girlfriend that is often not even seen. She doesn't come down, she lives in Genova, she doesn't, move, she's from the north. And every time there are three different actresses that played the same role, and every time she's super blonde because she's from the north. And Montalbano loves her, and at the same time, they don't want to be together, they don't want to live together. So he is the perfect woman, a composite of three people. One is the absent girlfriend. The other one is the present best friend, who is gorgeous, Swedish, right? She is rich. She is married to somebody. She's promiscuous. The husband is just the money, basically the purse. And she is a race car driver, which comes in handy in some of these episodes because she can drive a car anywhere. And she's also the one that constantly accompanies him to all his, shenanigans there. And then there is the third woman, Adelina, who is the woman that can cook. And that's his housekeeper, right? And that's the one that he sometimes even denies himself to his girlfriend in one episode because he wants to go home and eat what Adelina has prepared for him, right? And so you have this perfect, right, kind of composite of the perfect woman. And then the three guys, right? Because in reality, he lives in this homosocial environment, right? Where everybody is a man. And there is, Cattarella, who is the kind of the Zanni, character from Commedia dell'arte. He's just a buffoon, but smart. He's the only one who understands computers, paradoxically, in the entire place, right? And then there is Fazio. Without Fazio, nothing gets done because he's the efficient one. And then there is Augello, who, I suspect even the name is a joke, on a kind of a dirty joke because he's the womanizer. He's the one who is constantly, pursuing women and so on and so forth. So the character is this bridge, right, among many different social situations. And Sicily, you were a journalist too. You've investigated. Talk a little bit about, the kind of atmosphere.
That's a great question, because I think you touched on a really important topic, which is, the gender roles in Sicily and the way that Montalbano navigates through all of them. And in fact, I think that's one of the appeal of the character is his ability to navigate through what can be very vexed and complicated social relations. And in my research, I, for several years, studied the festival of St. Agatha in Catania, which is in the eastern part of Sicily, in the shadow of Mount Etna. Sant'Agata is one of the earliest Christian saints. She famously, was martyred after being rolled in glass by a Roman proconsul and a lot of horrible things. But if you go to this festival, it takes place February 3rd through 5th. It culminates on the 5th in Catania. What I've argued in my research is that this festival provides an environment where all of the gender roles can be turned upside down. It's a moment of release, right? Where men can freely express emotions, can break free of the bonds of their mothers, and instead replace them onto the saint herself in this one moment. And so in a way, the festival becomes this place out of time and out of space in the same way like the TV episode 2 breaks those structures and allows for this freedom to both navigate and to upend gender norms and roles.
Right, because Montalbano is always, in fact, one of the last episodes is when he falls in love with another woman, actually, and then he decides to keep supporting, Livia, because they at some point had lost a child that they both loved. But that was not enough to get married, right? So the idea that they're constantly staying on their own because they cannot adapt to compromise, right? And that becomes part of the deal. So Montalbano becomes this, Luca Zingaretti, who is not exactly, this kind of Adonis, but becomes the quintessential Italian man who is, kind of a bit of a chauvinist, but not too much, right? Is somebody who respects women, but still, has his own peccadillos on the side, and understands and even exploits, for instance, Augello's, womanizing when he needs somebody to, interrogate a witness or something, and she's a beautiful woman. He sends Augello and says, just persuade her.
And that may be Camilleri's greatest gift, that the quintessential Italian everyman is Sicilian.
Right. Yeah. Camilleri, incidentally, was married for like 70 years or something, right? And kept saying that the best day of his life was when he got married to his wife, who is still alive, She's 93 now, and he died 2 years ago. And Camilleri, I think, identified, he was not too happy with the casting at the very beginning, and then he got, he really liked it. But he identifies with Montalbano, but he looks like the doctor. Right? In real life, he did look like the doctor more than Montalbano, this kind of disheveled, right, man, this big, overweight man, constantly disheveled. So it's an interesting projection, right, that Camilleri, does with, and you're right, I mean, Montalbano is the quintessential Italian man, for better or for worse. So, yes. So I would like to open to some questions, if possible, and have people comment on the film or say something about the film.
Hi. So I just first wanted to say thank you for speaking to us, for taking your time out tonight. This was really interesting and informative to learn about Italian TV, and something that really piqued my interest was the fact that you two talked about how for this show, there were 37 episodes and 15 seasons, which is like 2 to 3 per season.
Yeah.
And which is completely different from American television. And I was just kind of wondering, were Italian TV shows, would their productions be almost treated as if they were not movies, kind of? Would they be kind of put together shorter, so the actors could pursue other projects in the year? I'm just kind of, if that makes any sense.
Well, it does make sense. The BBC does something very similar, right? Remember that television is sponsored by taxpayers. So in that sense, I mean, they have the money whether they're making them or not. If you've ever waited for Sherlock to come back at the BBC, I mean, we waited for 2 years one time. Some of my favorite programs, I mean, you have to really, wait until they get around to it. But that's exactly the point. I mean, there is a subscription that people have to pay for, and it is a national subscription. And now I think it is charged even on your electric bill or something. You can't avoid it because people were trying to kind of pretend they didn't have a TV or something. Oh, there's nothing to see here. So now, I mean, everybody has to pay because obviously many don't have a television set anymore. It's digital. It's all on the computer. But that is the form. These are really feature films. So if you think about it, it would be probably the same length of 6 or 7 episodes in another format. But yeah, I mean, they do 3, maximum 4 per year, per season.
I found it interesting how they went back and forth and threw in Sicilian words and sometimes didn't.
Right.
It was completely inconsistent. Even Montalbano sometimes says bambino, sometimes he says bicirido,
Right.
which is Sicilian. And when I read the books, I don't remember seeing that many Sicilian words in the books. Am I wrong? Am I forgetting?
Did you read them in English or in Italian?
I read them in English, yeah.
They probably would translate them because
They
it's
do
very...
have at the back, they often have Sicilian words, if you
Right.
recall. Right.
They translate them.
And how does that play with the northern Italian audience?
I'm an example of that. I had to learn it.
You had to learn it, okay.
You just
Thank
learn it. I mean, there are some Cabazizi and yeah, I mean, I have to, well, it's the context is usually, and you're right in the sense that they were using inconsistently. But if you think about it, Montalbano often uses the dialect when he's with people that he knows. Mm-hmm. When he is in his official capacity, right? He uses Italian, which is the lingua franca, right, for business and so on. But for instance, the conversation when he is asking the fishermen to actually go in and verify whether or not that cadaver has been there for a week, right? That is entirely in dialect.
I have to read the books out loud
Yeah.
to understand because they're written
Yeah.
in the dialect form.
That's
So-
right. I mean, I have to mouth it out. I mean, I
Yeah.
have to say it so that I can hear the rhythm and go for it. So it's a really great gift, because there are some. Sicily didn't have, a kind of theater that went all over Italy. Naples did. Right? Naples did, and Naples had a long tradition of using dialect, of sprinkling it, right, and doing entire plays in dialect. But Sicily has been, more kind of cut off from the literary circuit in that sense.
And there are in Sicily 12 distinct dialect subgroups, and several of them have been named by UNESCO as heritage languages now. Yeah.
Right, and there are many dialects. I mean, you say Italy was unified, in 1861, and every time I go like, not ours, because until 1870, the corner, right, where I grew up, that was not there. So I'm going like, okay, there was a little bit to wait. But the dialect I used to speak, I mean, I can speak, is not understood by the rest of Italy. There are many sub-languages as well, even within the dialects. So.
Yeah. And I guess to make a point too about Sicily historically had a number of conquerors, if you will. So and the language reflects that. So there are words that come from Arabic, from Greek, from French, from Italian, and from and you hear that both in the sound of the language and also in the syntax and the phonetics and phonology as well.
And the Greeks, the Normans, right, and all the invasions, absolutely. All right, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.